also have Gert from Tradeshift who was hanging around and wanted to come on the panel, I guess. So let's start. We're going to talk. There's not many of you, so I don't know if you're familiar with blockchain stuff or not. Do you guys familiar with Hyperledger, with Parity? Not really, maybe. So maybe let's start with you, Brian. You've been working in tech for decades now, right?
I'm old, yes.
And on many important open source projects that power many of the important bricks of the internet and tech in general. But for the past couple of years, you've been working on Hyperledger for the Linux Foundation. Can you tell us in a few words what it is?
Sure. So like other Linux Foundation projects, it's an attempt to pull together a network of hundreds of different companies and thousands of developers, both with those companies and beyond, to build a collection of building blocks for blockchain technology. And as we understand it, that means distributed ledgers, smart contracts, and all the sort of things that go along with that. And to try to say, you know, there's a lot of great ideas out there about how these things should be built, but ultimately plumbing is kind of boring, right? Like plumbing, we should spend some time on, we should try to make sure that it's right, but really as companies in this space, we should be trying to build things on top, right? And just like with operating systems and container technology, like we do with Kubernetes, and all these other domains, if we can just work together on enough of these common building blocks, then maybe we can kind of spend more of our time and effort on kind of the interesting apps on top.
Yeah, and I think the Linux Foundation has been key when it comes to building this kind of building blocks for the rest of technology, so yeah. Makes sense. Jutta, you've been working on Parity projects, and you have various different projects. Can you tell us about maybe some of the most famous ones, like Polkadot and Substrate, yeah, and how they work together?
So we started early on with like a completely new implementation of Ethereum when you started the company, and then over time, as we learned more how things are used through the different things we built, sort of this idea of Polkadot emerged initially as a tool for making blockchains interoperable, but then over time it evolved, like as we learned like what the deficiencies of blockchain are, like governance is one big thing that we're working on. So Polkadot comes, it's a new blockchain framework to allow people in particular to innovate really easily and adopt other technologies as they come along. So a framework that we have abstracted into a toolkit called Substrate, which is a general framework where it's now becoming really easy for people to launch their own chain. Like think of your app as a chain or feature as a chain. Like that's how we think things are evolving, and we want to make what we've learned in the past available through packaging it up. Like the networking stuff is really difficult. Like that all comes bundled. So all you need to care about is how you basically customize the state machine to your needs. Like whether you limit the subset of instructions because it's all you need. Or the way how you need to do governance because you're like a supply chain application, for example, and there are certain things you need to comply with. So that's what we're pushing towards with Substrate and Polkadot.
And Gert, you basically on the other side of the equation, you've been working at Tradeshift, who is a pretty well-known company focused more on supply chain financing and in all the various ways possible. And at some point, I don't know when it was, last year, something like that, you realized, okay, maybe we should think about building some blockchain projects because otherwise we're going to get disrupted. How did you come up to this realization?
So I think it was maybe not so much the disruption piece, but I think it was more actually the alignment between what we were doing. So, you know, we funded the company in 2010. And what we do is really digitizing supply chains. And it was based on the notion that, you know, how people are connected in their private lives and social networks and so on. This has not at all happened in the business world. So there's very little about business-to-business interactions that is digitized in any way. So we basically founded the company of a vision that it should be possible to break down all the silos that exist between businesses. And I think blockchain is kind of holds some of these promises. It's the fundamental idea of having a ledger that is shared between multiple participants, whereas the way that companies and supply chains everywhere in the world operate today is by hoarding data in silos and exchanging, very narrow, targeted pieces of messages between them in order to synchronize their worldview. And I think the socioeconomic impact on missing out on actually digitizing and creating liquidity for this kind of information is just enormous. I mean, it's $9 trillion at any point in time standing out between buyers and suppliers. So a lack of liquidity that especially hits the small and medium-sized segment of companies. So that's when we built TradeShift, it was basically the idea of could you invite the financiers, the logistics parties, the sellers and the buyers into the same transactions, and what is the value you could derive by doing that? So obviously, we need to be in on blockchain because it's a Hollywood playbook of most B2B blockchain cases. That is, what would happen if we actually invited 2, 3, 4 parties into the transaction? What is the value we could gain by doing this?
And talking about plumbing, give us an update on your project. What have you been using? Are you doing everything in-house or leveraging other projects?
Yeah, so I'm heading up a unit in TradeShift called Frontiers. And the way we are working is basically exploring emerging technologies right now, spending most of my cycles on blockchain. But we want to develop it through partnerships, creating joint ventures, deep partnerships, and spin-off companies. And some of the areas we're working in right now biggest one is financing to small and medium-sized companies. So basically tokenizing of IOUs between buyers and sellers and making those available on the blockchain. So think of the blockchain as a marketplace for these kind of things, but with a level of transparency you haven't seen in these kind of instruments before. Apart from that, because we are supply chain, then it's food safety, transparency in supply chains. And we also have a track where we look at the basic function of how do we do audits. Can you move that process from being a post things have happened and you're basically fixing exceptions to preventing exceptions and try to do audits on a transaction basis and turn it into a valuable thing instead of a chore.
Okay, let's deep dive a bit and find out like what makes you different. Like if I look at Hyperledger and Parity technologies, how would you say you're different, and how do you differ in your approach to kind of the same problem?
And I mean, I won't speak for Jutta. I think one important difference to understand is kind of the distinction between being an open source project and a nonprofit, kind of building these underlying layers, but we're not going to go in and build a network for you. We're not going to go and build an app for you. You can't really hire us to do that. Our business model is membership, right, through the consortium, right? And it's very much like, I think Parity could be like the Amazon Web Services of this space, if they want. I don't know if maybe that's the metaphor you would choose, but like, building on top of like these underlying technologies or writing their own. And we have a lot of our members, we have a vendor directory with 60 different companies that are building products and services on top of it.
And many of them are very big, like IBM.
Some of them are big, but some of them are startups. In fact, down in Blockchain Alley, there's a couple of them. There's one called Scroll Network that has just a real simple kind of file sharing kind of application designed for large files, but using Hyperledger Hyperledger Burrow, which is actually our Ethereum VM implementation as the kind of checksum and audit trail for file sharing. And it's a really fun small company. In fact, most of our members at this point are smaller mid-sized businesses. So we have the IBMs and the Intels and the SAPs, and they are building businesses on top of this. We also do have a lot of international companies. About 20% of our members are from China, another 20% from other parts of Asia. So, but we know that part of our mission is to lift up these companies, help them build businesses on top of this underlying plumbing, as much as it is about being the neutral home where that software is built.
Let's get another opinion on that and ask Jutta, like if you saw a company, let's say a small company, a medium company, a big company, would you recommend them to go to Parity or take Hyperledger's work and use it for their own stuff?
I guess it depends like what you want to do at this stage. I mean, the reason why we started the company back then was like we saw an opportunity for taking blockchain and building it into the future stack of the web, where we decentralize wherever we can decentralize to make things more secure, to put ownership into the user's hands wherever possible. And so this is what we try to do, and it's a lot of work. I mean, and that's not to be underestimated. So we have the ambition of being the technological leader in the space and building out this infrastructure. So we're really trying to push the forefront of what's possible. So if you're keen on exploring that, then I think you're right.
Okay, I'm launching an ICO. I want to create a new Ethereum-based token.
I mean, and if you want to do that, like everybody's using, I guess, at this stage, our software because it runs the Ethereum network. There's stuff we've done to help the community achieve a better way of doing ICOs. There was a service we built called Pickups, where we tried to build an open service for doing passport verification to help, like, to hit the sort of minimum standards that you should have in an ICO. So these are the things we're trying to do to actually build the different layers and pillars for this decentral web that many people hope is a better way of building businesses going forward.
And from your standpoint, have you seen a sort of seasonality? And of course, there was a huge wave at some point at the end of last year. How do you see the trend right now? Like, do you see a lot of projects that come to you?
I'm pretty excited at the moment to see how things are slowly moving actually to a building or like building out phase. If you look at the different projects, like we've cooperated with like a few select projects to actually explore how things can be used. Like one was the project we did with the World Food Program, where we deployed on a pretty large scale, I think the largest scale, or the biggest project so far, like the public network technology we built for Ethereum in a private setting. And that proved to be like a really useful thing because like there were no bugs like that we found in the deployment, right? The only thing we found was like an issue with the iris scanner, but like having hardened the tech stack we're promoting on a public network proved so beneficial to these systems, and that's where I see things moving forward. And I think like even though like it's all like huge scandals that we've seen around Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, like I think it has helped to see what the value of decentralization is beyond like early use cases as ICOs and whatnot, like that we actually need a better infrastructure that's fundamentally different so that it can enable people holding their data and whatnot. And that's what we want to build, and where people approach us to build like few select use cases and show how things can actually work going forward.
Mm. And at TradeShift, do you think, because we talked about the governance a bit earlier in the conversation, do you think by building a blockchain, there's a risk that you see other actors that are going to rely on your blockchain and maybe take over some of your clients?
There's always a risk that someone takes over some of your clients, but I actually think we are pretty perfectly positioned to actually create real value from the blockchain. I think it's a common thread that when you look at a lot of the business-to-business blockchain use cases, and also some of the use cases that companies have invested in, that they are almost more about economics than they are about technology, right? So if you're looking at, for example, a project that looks at creating transparency in the supply chain, you know that you need to onboard a lot of different actors, small companies, large companies across many different regions of the world. So the question quickly becomes, how do we actually incentivize people to join into these networks? And I think that's one of the promises of blockchain, that is you can kind of connect the thing about what is the information we share, what are the contracts that govern this information, and how is it connected to the final settlement of value between the participants. And that's actually an economic question, right? So you have this technology that promises to enable fundamentally new economic models. And I think that's a great thing, that companies are starting to asking those questions. You know, what happens if we start acting a little bit like some of the digital leaders in this world, which are all two-sided market models, when we start inviting multiple parties to the transaction and try to apply that into the supply chains, for example. But I think what companies maybe underestimated sometimes. It's building the blockchain castle in the desert thing, that you have all this nice technology, but you still need people to agree on what are the digital standards we use, how do we agree on processes and rule books, what are the contracts we are governed by, what's the governance of the total infrastructure, who can opt in, who can opt out, how do you trust the information, and so on and so forth. Last mile integrations, user interfaces. And I think we pretty much, in our business, have all of this. So I see the step for us to go into the blockchain and enable the 1.5 million companies in our network to actually join into the blockchain and pump volume into the blockchain. I think is a very, very small step compared to going the other way around. So for us, I see it as a great opportunity, as well as for the companies in the network.
Yeah, and it feels like it's sort of leveling the playing field as well. But maybe at Hyperledger, because you're working on open source projects, do you think there's a risk that by building these open source bricks, some tech giants are going to take those projects and become the sort of leaders of the blockchain world, and it's going to be the same as tech as it is today, but now on the blockchain?
Well, this was the debate even in the earliest days of open source software.
Yeah.
Like, what would happen if Microsoft picked up the Apache web server and put it into Windows NT?
And now, of course, they're contributing.
Well, exactly. Microsoft joined the Linux Foundation, like last October, and an internal thread went around, which was basically, "Have we won? Is it time to go home?" Right? But back when Apache talked about it, and it was like, we have this license, the Apache license, that allows companies of big companies, small companies, to take this technology and even make modifications to it and keep that to themselves and use it inside of very proprietary products. Is that them stealing from us? Is that them, playing unfair? And the rationalization we came to is, if they picked up Apache and we're confident in our implementation of the HTTP protocol, then what we're doing is helping the rest of the world pick up that standard, right? I mean, because most of us were not motivated by an all software must be free thing so much as we were we want to protect the web, make the web an open place that didn't become the Microsoft web, which it kind of ran the risk of becoming in the late 90s, or later on the Netscape web, optimized for this, optimized for that, but that it was instead this open playing field. And the fastest way to get that standardized adoption, we felt, was by having a high quality, production quality reference implementation and very freely allowing these companies to embed it. And the gambit was, it's a numbers game. The more organizations that adopt it, the more organizations will find a bug, and rather than fix the bug and keep the fix for themselves, they'll contribute it upstream. That's so much more efficient, right? That's so much more, you get value out of it. And sure enough, that paid off, right?
I mean, everybody gets value. Yeah.
And even though IBM did adopt Apache into their IBM WebSphere, right? They turned around and contributed a lot of code back into the Apache web server and ported it to Windows, right? And I think we found a balancing act in the whole of the open source community where as long as the code is under an open license, right? But also the development process is public. That's the key thing. As long as the decisions aren't being made in a back room serving the agenda of just one of the companies, as long as it's a duocracy. And if you want to influence the direction of the code, show up and say, I'm going to work on this feature. And if anyone else wants to help me, great. But we're going to get this upstreamed. That's how stuff is done. That's how agendas are set in the open source world. And that gives us a layer of insulation against, I believe, against being co-opted to serve just the needs of one entity.
And there's one advantage in open source software as well. It's that it's pretty good when it comes to bugs. Because you have a lot of contributors looking at bugs and forking the code to make a patch and stuff like that.
You can't depend upon it. I mean, there's certainly, with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow as a principle, but sometimes there's not enough eyeballs. So you do need you need to invest in growing the community. You do need to invest in making sure that that pipeline from being just an ordinary user to being a bug fixer, to being a contributor, to becoming a core maintainer, the activation energy for each of those hops is as minimal as possible, right? Yeah. And so that's, again, part of the science that we're trying to develop at the Linux Foundation as a whole, and the science and art, really, of community management and ecosystem management to try to get that flow of developers into the code.
And what's your community strategy at Parity when it comes to open source projects and stuff like that?
So, I mean, we are open source for a reason, and that ties back to what you said. I mean, you want to have a strong community around, your code base and people adopting it. I mean, really what we've built, I mean, there's there just needs so much building at this stage that developing stuff in a closed way, like, you won't get anywhere. I mean, you need a community around it, and being able to share stuff, like, also to just learn. There's so much learning that needs to happen at this stage. Like governance, you can't do this in isolation. Like all the things we've seen now with Ethereum, all the problems, like it's only possible to improve that and build those future systems if you have that community.
And at TradeShift, are you still at the learning point as well, or are you?
In terms of community?
Well, not just community, but blockchain in general.
I think, to be honest, I think everyone is.
Yeah.
So I think the technology is developing so fast. So the only way to really stay in the loop is being part of it and actually learning by building things, and try to push those children out into the real world.
Would you consider yourself as a researcher?
Not in the academic sense of the word, no. We are definitely very business focused, but we are definitely on a journey of exploration or research, if you can call it that. But it's really with a fundamentally commercial outlook, right? So we don't want to be the guys that run around in lab coats and have cool blockchain laboratory experiments. We want to make a lot of experiments so we can find the 3, 5, 6 things that can actually take on their own commercial life and make a real impact. So what we're driven by in my organization, that is really things that at a fundamental level either has an economic impact for companies in the network, and we are moving $500 billion here in 2018, which is 3-point-something% of the global economy. And whatever comes out of this lab has to register on that scale. So that's, and that means we need to commercialize these things and show that it can deliver actual value to actual companies.
Okay, we just have a few seconds left. I'm going to ask you three one question. If you had to say, when are we going to hit version 1.0 of Hyperledger, Parity, and TradeShift blockchain projects? When would that be?
We'll hit version 1.3 of Fabric by the end of the month. And across the board, I think we're very much at a time when you can put it into production now. Fabric and Sawtooth and Burrow and many of these other technologies. We're ready.
So with Substrate, we are moving now to beta phase where people, and we have a bunch of projects using it now, building their own chains on top. And with Polkadot, we hope to be in a state where we can launch the network at the end of next year.
And at TradeShift?
Yeah, 12 months from now, we will definitely be moving significant volume on the blockchain. And every node technology stands alone, so where it has rough edges, we and everybody else need to make up for.
Yeah, it feels like in blockchain, 3 months equals 1 year, basically. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.